very pleased to have with us today Dan Bowman, a long-term friend, confidant, and one of the real leaders of the Chambers of Commerce and the business fraternity of Indonesia, but also has a very deep understanding, Dane, of being a lawyer in Indonesia for many, many decades, and prior to that, of course, in the Middle East with Aramco. He originally heralds from Chicago, and not only do I put him as one of the greatest Indonesian pundits, but also a wonderful friend and mentor. So, Dan, thanks for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing your views in a moment. Leading into that, I think it's very evident that Indonesia is struggling to come to terms with a monumental shift in government. I think it was Lord Acton that stated power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't think he lived in a time or had an opportunity to visit the Dutch East Indies, but in the case of Prabowo, a man of undoubted talent, but of questionable character, and has had issues in his background where mass murdering didn't seem to affect him. He's also a very confident man, and he's actually gone through many funding efforts, much of it borrowed so that he could fail in several election attempts, but not unlike Stephen Bradbury, the famous Australian gold champion of the Olympics for world skiing. He basically was the last man standing and got the gold medal, and Prabowo's kind of done that. He's the last man standing in the new order, and society finally got to a point where society decided, actually, we want somebody that's stronger and can stand up to the oligopolies, the political parties. And Indonesia's always operated on a key man basis. Even the political parties tend to have a key personality that they follow in by. But I think if Lord Acton was around today and saw Prabowo get elected, he might actually modify his quote something along the lines of power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And absolutely the corrupt will surround themselves with the corruptible. So their ancestors continue to control corruption infinitum in our beloved Indonesia. I'm sure Don McFetrich and Kevin O'Rourke, when they listen to this audio later, can wordsmith Acton better than I can. But I think Pope Francis did a wonderful summary of corruption when he said it's ultimately corruption is paid by the poor. And that brings us into today's topic, that if the poor are going to pay for it, and they are the victim and they are not corruptible, is it only the poor that can interrupt the corruption cycles? If we can just jump to the next slide there, please. So just to give a very quick overview, we're going to look at what the government's doing in response to both react to some of the civil unrest that's occurring and what they're doing to cause it. We'll also look at some of the potential business and economic implications, and also not only the risk mitigation strategies, but strategies that businesses need to look at in light of this dark Indonesian movement that is emerging. So, Dan, if I can switch over to you to give an overview of being Johnny on the spot in Jakarta, how you're seeing, feeling, and interpreting this situation.
Very good, Paul. I've always liked to follow Lord Acton and Pope Francis. So why don't we just get to what happened? So there was a highly organized set of protests, not involving a lot of people, tens of thousands possibly. We don't have accurate numbers yet, but they occurred in 9 Indonesian cities, widely dispersed: Jakarta, Surabaya, Makassar, Ternate, Yogyakarta, Medan, Bandung, Semarang, and Bengkulu. And these protests have a theme that's called Indonesia Gelap, or Dark Indonesia. And there is a subsidiary theme that is called Kabur Aja, which means just run away. And these are terms that have been created by the students. Kabur Aja reflects the frustration of not being able to get meaningful jobs in the Indonesian economy. And Indonesia Gelap reflects frustration with major changes that Prabowo has made in the first few days of his administration. These protests are accompanied by 28 demands. And these demands are, reflect a potpourri of complaints by civil society. They're not really to be taken seriously. This is an expression of frustration about the economic condition, or perhaps it is supported by opposition groups whose rice bowls are being broken at the present time. Now, I'd like to go over some of the economic reasons why why the protests are occurring. The first one, of course, is that there are cuts to education. Now, just today, Prabowo's brother came out and said, "You misunderstand. We're not cutting any education. You will continue to receive your stipends and the like." And he blamed it all on misinformation. But there are other deeper causes as well. One of the big issues that Prabowo is trying to tackle is the huge impact on the budget of imported fuel. And a lot of this imported fuel, and also a lot of the natural gas or LPG production, is diverted to canisters for poor people. They call them melons because they're painted green and they're 3 kilogram containers. These have started to dry up in the market, along with other types of fuel, and that is causing concern in the communities. I can see in my own community, the warehouse that is normally stacked to the rafters with these things is now half empty. And this is a benefit that the poor get, and it motivates them to become more active in civil life. Another complaint of the students is that, in essence, and this is a big move that Prabowo has made, all state-owned companies have now been privatized. They have been put under a investment fund that's called Dana Terra, which is headed by Prabowo, and the CEO of which is Rosan Ruslani, who is now the head of BKPM, former ambassador to the United States, and former chairman of Prabowo's campaign. And then for day-to-day activities, Pandu, God, I forget Pandu's last name. He is Luhut Panjaitan's nephew, has been put in day-to-day operations. And this is being seen by civil society as a privatization of state-owned enterprises along the lines of what happened in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet government. So these are all causes for concern for civil society. I would say that the latter one I just mentioned is probably less important than the unavailability of melons, because little things in Indonesia are what cause the problems, not the big overarching issues that normally the students will be propounding. Now, another potential cause of this unrest is infighting between different political groups. And that is much more dangerous because the Prabowo has made another huge swipe at entrenched interest groups. Just today, he arrested Khatib, he arrested the head of basically a syndicate that took a percentage from all fuel sales to Pertamina and reallocated the proceeds to Parliament. His name is Mohammed Reza, and he has been arrested along with several Pertamina people. And this is a big swipe at a major political constituency. He's also arrested a close confidant of Megawati Sukarno Putri, who is named Hasto Cristianto. And he has the idea is that he will turn on one of Prabowo's supporters, one of his frenemies, whose name is Joko Widodo, the former president. And there, at this protest, there were banners that appeared that said, "Arrest Jokowi." So you can see that there's behind here, there's a lot of intergroup fighting. And as in Thailand, major political groups speak to each other through street violence. Okay, so that's sort of the background to the whole thing. And there's a few other little sidelights to it. There has been counterinsurgency techniques deployed, including the cutting of cell phones, the prohibition of televising the protests. Basically, they haven't gone after the print media, but they cut off the contemporaneous televised coverage. The cell phones, I can attest, I was there, and the cell phones went off. So and that now they're also doxing journalists, et cetera. So there are counterinsurgency techniques being applied, but there is no overt violence toward the protesters. They've been very, very careful not to provoke any kind of action like they did in 1997, which led to the downfall of Suharto. And the response has been relatively measured up to this point. Now, in your notes, you mentioned Donatera, the revised military law. Yeah, this is another one where the military is taking a much greater role in national affairs, going back to a doctrine of Suharto called Dwi where the military basically was embedded in it was embedded in provincial and Kabupaten society in order to provide intelligence and also to provide guidance to the various administrators of government. And although that is probably a complaint of the students, it's more related to the fact that the military is taking control back from the police. In 2004, I believe it was, at the insistence of the United States, the military and the police were separated, and the police acceded to most of the economic opportunities, much to the chagrin of the military. And now the military is coming back, and that is definitely a potential flashpoint because there are a lot of rice bowls police to be broken. Many police generals have become multimillionaires, and they don't really want to see that go away. Now, the legal crackdown on the opposition, as I said, it's mostly at this point counterinsurgency techniques, a little bit of doxing, but this is being taken very, very seriously by both Prabowo and his brother, who came out in the media today. Prabowo said, "You protesters have it all wrong," indicating the economic nature of the protest about Indonesia Galap. Our economy China in 2050. So he has, he is directly addressing the economic argument. His brother, meanwhile, came out in a separate statement and said that you have it all wrong. The funding for you students will not be cut off. Now, how many groups are joining this? Unlike the protests in the most recent protests, which unseated the governor of Jakarta, whose name was Ahok, a Christian politician who basically angered the Islamic right. Those protests were organized by Prabowo, so he knows very, very well what can happen if a large protest gets out of control. He claimed to me that there were 400,000 people involved in those protests. It was more like, I'd say, about 200,000. I saw the aerial photos. And the protests right now in Indonesia have not reached that level in terms of gross numbers in a single location. However, what is worrying about these protests is that they are highly organized and they took place in 9 cities. And they have a consistent theme and they have very good communication, which the counterinsurgency techniques interrupted, but which is helping them. And they have a certain amount of media backing, but not too much. The media is being very, very careful about this because they don't see a winner, so they're not going to back anybody until they see what happens. Now, will these protests get bigger? Well, they threw out their opening shot. There has been a response from the government that admits they happened. There may be some things done to placate at least some of the protesters, but the underlying major reason for the protests is still there. There is a lack of jobs, especially for Gen X. The rupiah is depreciating quickly, and that depreciation will certainly accelerate because of Dana Terra, because it's going to call into question the fiscal stability of the government. And there may also be some cabinet shakeups coming because Prabowo has become disenchanted with some of the performance of his cabinet and also senior politicians. For example, he is trying to maneuver to replace the head of the central bank so that credit can be expanded and it can fund various programs that he wants to undertake in order to placate groups within the country. The main one of his programs is the free lunch program, which is costing several $billions per year, and that is his main bone that he's throwing to the people who could possibly overthrow him. So at this point, the summary, Paul, would be that this is an opening salvo in protests. There is a possibility that this could become much bigger depending on how the economy goes. And the government at this point is handling it properly. It's handling it in a they're sort of underplaying it. There's certainly no response like there was in 1997. And it will be very interesting to see how these various groups negotiate with each other in the coming few weeks. So that would be my summary of the thing.
I think it's worth just sort of dwelling on some of the points you made, particularly the aspect of control. Do you think, look, I mean, we all know Prabowo can mobilize groups. He'll be very reticent to mobilize security forces. One, because of the connotations of using security forces, but secondly, he doesn't know to what degree he can exercise control over them. He's no longer a military general. He thinks he is, but he no longer has command and control over them. Of course, he doesn't know to what degree the police will or won't support him, or the flashpoint where they'll turn against him, both for financial reasons. And we know that Indonesia's a place where people seek power for money, and the police are about to lose power due to the change of government and the army's new role. Can Prabowo alternatively use Islamic groups? And I know that Ramu's going to touch on that a little bit later, but what's your feel on that, Dan?
Well, first of all, a senior general I talked to about the threat from the police toward Prabowo, who has more control over the military than he does over the police, certainly. They basically said, no problem. We can sweep the police aside in a second. The military is orders of magnitude more powerful than the police, and they know it, and we know it. And there's not going to be a defection from the police unless things get so far out of control that there's, they see a political advantage in doing that. However, in terms of Islamic groups, Prabowo organized the Islamic groups in Indonesia are coming back. Now I see this myself. I mean, the mosques are getting louder. They're not doing the call to prayer anymore. It's almost a constant speakers all over Jakarta and all over many of the other Islamic cities. So Prabowo, I think, is keeping that powder dry. Now he co-opted the Islamic groups to bring down AHOC. But then he turned on them. So the Islamic groups are not particularly trustful of Prabowo. And would they be utilized in order to oppose a segment of society which is naturally opposed to them, which is the intellectual/student movement? Maybe they would. Maybe they could be mobilized to do that. I think there are some Islamic groups that are sincere and are not wanting to be political pawns, major ones. And I think there are some groups that are they're extremely violent and are definitely pay to play. So, for example, Habib Razik and his group are small, but they are very violent. And if if things look like they're turning against Prabowo, my my personal opinion is that he will unleash those before he does the military. I think the military is the absolute last. I think he would resign before he unleashed the military, because that's what he knows what happened to him in 1997. So he's going to find any kind of counterinsurgency tactic he can if this gets bigger. But we're quite a ways from that.
And what about external influences, relationships between Prabowo, LaHood, other key leaders with China, America's desire to get more active in Asia, Saudi Arabia's influence, particularly into the Islamic world in Indonesia? Do you see any of those being a catalyst, or do you think this is purely an internal issue?
No, I don't. Prabowo is very distrustful of everybody. He distrusts the Chinese. That comes from his father. He distrusts the Americans. The reason he's put Donna Terra together is because he distrusts the lending institutions. He can't get any equity investments, so he's repurposing dividends from the state-owned companies into this fund in order to basically fund his own downstream projects. And he has 15 downstream projects he wants to do, starting with bauxite. And, basically he's going to create the Saudi Arabia of minerals, which is going to completely fail. I don't see much. I saw one instance where somebody blamed USAID for starting the protests. And I found that a little comical, because all the USAID people are locked out of their office and packing their belongings. So I don't know how they got the time to start this protest. They're not blaming the Australians. So basically it's, I don't think they're trying to change the narrative by blaming foreigners. I think, they're taking these criticisms on directly. And the fact that both he and his brother made a statement about it today, I think, the guy, Prabowo actually is a pretty straight ahead guy. He really is. He may be misguided in terms of his economic analysis, but he is making big shakeups in Indonesia, and he has a fairly clear plan. And this protest is something that he is responding to in a pretty skillful manner.
That said, Dan, and maybe we can leave it to the end, and I'll give you some time to think about it while we finish the presentation. But in modelling some of the sovereign wealth redirection, Putin style, and in some of hitting into the state budget and the public servants, Trump style and Musk style, is he potentially going to have a Gough Whitlam type fate, that if you try to disrupt too much, the disruption bounces back on you? So just hold that thought for now. We'll move on with the presentation and maybe dig into that a little bit later. Back to you guys, my guys. Can you go to the next slide, please, and carry on?
Thank you, gentlemen, for adding a wider perspective into how these protests have taken place and what could be the futuristic factors that can trigger these protests. So I am trying to break down the key triggers that will determine whether these protests lose momentum or escalate into a sustained movement. The formal demonstrations may have peaked last week, but the underlying grievances haven't disappeared. What happens next will depend on how these 6 key factors will play out. Number 1, will the demonstrations continue, sustain, and grow? Well, the initial wave of protests was largely student-driven, but now the question is whether we will see a second phase. If the students remain mobilized in the Javanese hotspots such as Jakarta, Yogyakarta, and Surabaya, or for that matter, even in Sumatra's Medan city, protests could continue rather intermittently over the coming weeks. Secondly, what are the prospects for broader mobilization? Well, if these protests spread beyond students and labor unions or civil society groups step in, it could turn in and gain longevity. If labor unions join, well, strikes and industrial slowdowns could also follow suit. And this could shift from being a political to, rather being an economically disruptive demonstration. And if more disparate rural protests or worker-led demonstrations emerge, the geographic spread could put greater pressure on the government. Thirdly, will the government escalate? So far, Prabowo's government has avoided direct mass arrests of students and instead have targeted opposition politicians like Hasto Cristianto, as Dan had earlier put it. And if we start seeing student leader arrests, that's a clear sign of a harsher crackdown coming. If military or tactical police forces are deployed, this would signal a major shift towards suppression. And herein, a key indicator to watch out for would be mass detentions or aggressive dispersal methods. If that happens, it could trigger public sympathy for protesters and may even fuel further unrest. Fourthly, will the political elites stay united? Now, this is very important. Djokovic's stance remains uncertain so far. He has aligned with Prabowo so far, but if opposition pressure grows, he may need to reposition. Ministerial divisions could emerge if economic risks grow. Those like Luhut Panjaitan or key finance officials or other power players may push for a policy shift. After all, Luhut is Prabowo's key power broker. And if these economic elites start losing confidence, Prabowo may be forced to adjust his approach or even offer concessions. Yeah, talking about the fifth element, that is religious influence, I will just skim through it because Dan has given us a very comprehensive perspective about how this can pan out. So the moderate factions, like the Nadlatul Ulama, the NU, and the Muhammadiyah remain influential power players. If they back the protest, it could reshape the movement. So far, the NU and the Muhammadiyah have remained neutral, but they have been granted coal mining concessions. And this could suggest that they are being kept on Prabowo's side. A pivot by these organizations would add legitimacy to opposition movements and even it can pressure the government. A final aspect, a red herring here is the Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, or the HTI, which has been flagged previously in 2017 for attempting to exploit, protests. If radical elements of this sort get involved, security responses could escalate rather quickly. Finally, talking about the economic trends, will the market and business reactions add pressure to the evolving security environment? Well, investor confidence is shaky, and if these protests disrupt business hubs, government buildings, or even supply chains, economic risks could grow. The Indonesian rupiah's fluctuations, potential capital flight risks, and even bondholder panic selling are indicators to watch out for. These figures will determine whether unrest subsides or escalates further. With this in mind, I think the broader question now is how all of this impacts businesses and the economy in general. Raga, over to you to walk us through the key business and economic implications.
Right, Raga, before we go on to that, I've got one question. Just go back to that slide, please. Dan, obviously the key personalities involved are linked to the political side, and can't remember the guy's full name, but Lembong, I think he was the finance minister or trade minister. But when you've got him and, like you said, Cristianto, there's some very high profile figures. Now, yep, okay, they're big corruption cases, but I don't think there's too many guys with white gloves at those upper echelons of, and once you start making a point and bringing them in, you're opening up a can of worms. And the Prabowo clan, his brother, those associated with him, it is a bold move and a risky move because it does create a vulnerability. Once you start lopping off the heads, the tails are going to start to wag. I know Prabowo's a smart and cunning man, both politically and his military prowess is, world famous. And there's a reason the Americans don't like him, and that's they couldn't manipulate him. But do you see that can potentially be a catalyst? These internal government rifts open with some little cracks and become gaping cascades, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, I think that this is less about the 28 demands of the students. I suspect that there is some outside financing going into this. Now, Tom Lembong, he was punished for two reasons. First of all, he was the head of Anies Baswedan's campaign in Jakarta. And second of all, he joined another protest that has not been mentioned today, which was the spontaneous protest of the students against the potential changes to the election law. And he joined that protest. Now that's Prabowo's got to be really, really careful here because he's got enemies who are very powerful and prone to use violence because their rice bowls are being broken. And he also has issues that are incredibly important to the public, not only economic, but 80-something% of the public is in favor of elections. And he tried to do away with those. He and Megawati tried to do away with those right at the beginning of the term, and there was pushback on that. So your question is whose rice bowl is he breaking? Tom Lembong doesn't matter. Luhut doesn't really matter that much anymore because the mantle has now passed to Eric Thohir and his brother. But one person to watch who has a history of this is Tommy Winata. And Tommy Winata is the one of the 9 dragons who are the Chinese Indonesian that control much of the economy of Indonesia. He made a big move against Tommy Winata in the tin business. And that is something that is simmering down below, and it really needs to be watched. The other one is Jokowi. Jokowi, is a former peasant who rose to royal status, and they would like to get him back down to peasant status. Now, they don't want him to, they're eyeing each other and circling each other right now, and nobody has made a real move. But these kind of banners about let's try Jokowi and the fact that Hasto has been put in jail, that's potentially a provocation to somebody that's got a lot of police and he's got a lot of money and a lot of police in his pocket. So that's, if there's going to be anything that sustains and possibly enhances these protests, it's going to be from the elites whose rice bowls are being broken.
Great insight. Thank you. Raga?
All right. So the Dark Indonesia protests, we've so far analyzed the political side of things, but let's also look at the economy, the businesses and investments that are being impacted. Firstly, investor confidence is being affected, and the rupiah is under pressure, markets are volatile, and foreign investors are holding back on new projects. The government is pushing its Dhanantara Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is around $20 billion, to attract capital, but whether it will calm investor nerves remains uncertain. Secondly, business operations are being disrupted as well. Protests in Jakarta and major cities are blocking roads, delaying transportation and supply chains, and raising costs for companies. And if this continues, factories and exporters will all feel the squeeze. And third, Indonesia's workforce is at risk. The education budget cuts, which Prabowo's ministries come out to deny, mean that there are fewer scholarships. And the Kaburaja Tulu movement is growing, where young professionals are looking abroad and there is brain drain. If this brain drain accelerates, businesses will struggle to find skilled workers. And when we look at the consumer spending, it is gradually slowing down. Subsidy cuts and rising costs are squeezing household budgets, which means that lesser money is flowing into retail and real estate. If the spending weakens, businesses and the revenues could potentially be affected, leading to job losses. Finally, when we look at the whole thing from the big picture, global investors are watching closely, and Indonesia is a key exporter of coal, nickel, palm oil, amongst others. And if unrest persists, international buyers may look elsewhere, and a loss of confidence could hurt long-term trade deals and investment flows. The bottom line is that if the protests continue, investments will stall, businesses will continue to struggle, and economic growth could slow down. And Prabowo has ambitions of an 8% GDP growth rate. So the government must act either by stabilizing policies or risking a deeper fallout. And the next few months will decide the economic trajectory of the country.
Thanks, Raga. So I'm just going to jump in here quickly. In terms of risk mitigation at the moment, so as Dan said, it's critical to keep an eye out on the scale and spread of protests, given that the underlying tensions are very high and the depth and scale of the economic issues, and just the fact that the elites are just trying to cut themselves a bigger piece of the pie. Indonesian security forces, unfortunately, are not known for restraint or de-escalation, and this is especially the police. Just over 2 years ago, over 130 people were killed after the police tear gassed a football stadium. So that's still quite fresh. And I think, as Dan rightly mentioned, if we start seeing violent crackdowns, we will see larger counter protests against the security forces too. It will also be telling if Islamists or pro-government paramilitary groups like the Pemuda Pancasila, for example, mobilize against the protesters. This will lead to violence, and it will be an attempt to make the protesters seem illegitimate, make their concerns seem illegitimate. So at this point, it's critical to conduct liaisons with not only with contractors and security providers, transport providers, but also government officials and security forces to see where vulnerabilities to operations lie and to understand where there is exposure to risks that need to be mitigated and against. Now, given the fluidity of the situation, it would be good to begin considering different scenarios based on the triggers that Dan, Paul, and Ramu and the others talked about. So at this junction, travel journey management and worker safety are the main operational risks in the coming weeks, also depending on how the protest movement plays out. For this, of course, work from home, travel protocols, and related must be looked at and assessed. But moving on, depending on how things unfold, risk exposure in general could increase from reputational risks or more targeted risks. For example, if entities are seen as brushing away the concerns that protesters have, or we might even see major security risks. For example, if there are counter groups mobilized, or if police are commanded to harshly disperse protesters. So at this point, the key to risk mitigation is keeping that flexibility, to react to different situations. Paul, would you have anything to add here before we close this off? And maybe you and Dan can come in with comments. And if there's any questions, we can go into that.
Yeah, sure. Look, before we move on to the business risks, I think the operational risks you highlight, the most important, I think, is every fire needs a spark and it needs fuel. I don't think we have those conditions yet. I think, like Dan says, it's not gaining momentum seemingly at the moment. It's being managed fairly well. There's a lot of restraint. But I think the pipelines have been built to bring in the fuel. If it's not handled correctly, that fuel can come in. And Indonesia has a history of when you think it's not going to blow, just one little decision, like you pointed out, Dan, with the cheap gas for families to cook with, or for the kaki lima, kitchen stalls to use, the most unexpected issue becomes a spark. And I think we need to keep really prudent. Ramu, I like your triggers. And I also think that spark could intentionally be trying to undermine the police by Prabowo to give the military more strength, putting pressure on the police so they take the brunt of their poor SOPs, and everybody can go, don't look here, those nasty police did that, we didn't want them to do that. And Prabowo's cunning enough to use them as a spark so that he can re-empower the military, which is, as Dan pointed out, infinitely more prepared, better structured, and therefore a much more useful tool for Prabowo, especially given his background with it. Before we take questions, we might just...
Paul, can I jump in here real quick?
Yes, mate.
I just wanted to, in terms of the operational preparation, having been through a couple of evacuations, including the one in 97 and 98, I wanted to give a couple of practical pieces of advice, especially for companies that have individuals in Indonesia, especially in the major cities. Have some cash in your safe. If you don't have a safe, get a safe. Get a round trip ticket and have that an open round trip ticket and have it available. If things look like they're going south, I mean, I don't think you have to do that now, but have an evacuation plan, know your evacuation route, know who's going to get you there, and also be aware of the surroundings where there could be, there could be flashpoints around government monuments or nearby mosques or things like that, and just be prepared. Because when it happened in '98, we had a little bit of warning. There were escalating protests and there was warning, but at the last minute, a lot of people were caught flat-footed because they didn't have their tickets, they didn't have cash, they didn't have a way to the airport because there was only, at that time, only one way to the airport. So actually, many of us were evacuated in armored personnel carriers that our friend Prabowo sent. So I just wanted to give those practical pieces of advice. It's never too soon to start, to put together an evacuation plan just in case things get out of hand.
And Dan, all people do is they only consider Jakarta and their offices. They forget about, in our case, in those days, it wasn't as big as it is now, but we had 17,000 people speaking over 120 different languages. So the complexities, you can't leave it to the end. They're going back to so many countries, so many islands. It's a very technical process, not just the international evacuation, but the internal relocations, the locking people down in safe havens. One thing that I helped Tom to consider back then, which he kind of probably took on a little bit late, was don't forget that Bandung is a really good option for both internal relocation and for temporary safe haven elsewhere, but also for international evacuation. A lot of hotels and a lot easier a route when things are choked up going to Jakarta. We might move along in the interest of time and move on to the business issues. And Dan, what I see now is large companies, if they haven't yet, they should be really looking at the impacts of how their global headquarters are going to start looking at Indonesia risk as a destination, risk to their return on capital, risk to whether they're going to have legal stability and legal clarity over their own investments, whether issues, allow companies to ship resources offshore before adding costs of processing, which are more than their margins, needing to keep cash from business operations in Indonesia. Give us a quick summary of how you're seeing that side of it unfold. Am I premature to be raising those concerns?
Oh no. Anybody who's in Indonesia, my hat is off to you because one of my businesses has put several $1 million in here, and just the bureaucracy is so difficult. Yeah, you do have to think about risks. I mean, just highlighting one is the fact that now you have to keep all of your export earnings on an internal account in Indonesia for a year. That's sort of a desperation move, and you can manage that with hedging. And that's probably something that should be considered. In terms of the other risks, I'm not sure. There are specific risks that apply to specific companies. The business environment here is just plain bad. I mean, let's not sugarcoat it. It's just terrible. There is increasing protectionism. There are increasing requirements that are hard to meet. There is no free transferability of capital, and it's just, from a business standpoint, a deteriorating situation that I see getting worse. There are several signs in the mining space, for example. Mining permits are being used as political pawns, and they're paying off various interest groups. They tried to pay off the universities to get them to not protest, but that didn't work. And we're just seeing some very strange economic decision making that is very inward looking. It is not oriented at all toward the international market. And the last person the government, or the last group the government is thinking of, is international investors. So I think it's, we're just going to have to hold on to our seats here and see what happens. And, maybe the skies will clear, but just look up and you're going to see some dark clouds on the way, and maybe the rainstorm will pass. I don't really have much additional specific advice. I mean, it's just there's a multitude of problems facing companies in Indonesia, including Indonesian companies. And by the way, the Indonesian companies are moving overseas. The big Chinese conglomerates are also moving out. So it's not just foreigners that are under pressure here. It's also the big wannabe multinationals with majority Indonesian ownership.
All right, Dan, look, really appreciate it.